And we're good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Community Book Center is very pleased to be hosting our first official live event since COVID. As you know, we've been doing most of our events via crowdcast, but today we have a special event. We are so honored to have Dr. Tara T. Green, who is a professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Sister Tara is a native New Orleanian, our very own. As we say here, she's from the best bank, represent, and she is here to share with us some of the information about her two books that we have in stock right now. Love, Activism, and the Respectable Life of Alice Dunbar Nelson. This is the one we're really celebrating today in honor of International Women's History Month. And we also have See Me Naked, which has spawned a lot of interest and curiosity, Black women defining pleasure in the interwar era. So these are the two books that we will be discussing. They are available here at Community Book Center. Those of you who are online, you can also order them as well. And Tara, this is what you do, so tell us who you are.
Well, as you mentioned, I grew up in the New Orleans area. I am a graduate of Dillard University and a graduate of Louisiana State University. My parents are from the South, so I consider myself to be a Southerner. My mother is from North Louisiana. My dad is from Mississippi. And so all of that rich culture of storytelling, of good eating of food, of love and laughter in this complicated world that is a complicated world for Black people. I learned what I know beginning with my family and their stories. Pausing as I see people I know coming in the bookstore. Yay!
Come on in. Come on in.
So you're on camera, Brenda Marie. This is Brenda Marie Osby. Our New Orleans poet.
I'll get back to you.
You'll see I acknowledge her in the book.
So I am going to switch cameras because this one is not really focusing very well. And There we go. That's better. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this. You can kind of see yourself there.
So are we ready?
Much better.
Because I'm just gonna
Yes.
talk about,
Yes,
okay.
please.
Okay, so sometimes people ask me why did I write a book about Alice Dunbar Nelson? So Alice Dunbar Nelson, first of all, I say that I met Alice Dunbar Nelson when I was a student at Dillard University. I was an English major at Dillard University. And reading an anthology that had a short story, and I can't even remember what short story, but in the biography, it said that she graduated from Straight College. And so I knew as a sophomore or junior at that time that Straight College merged with another institution to become Dillard University. So that immediately sort of connected me to her. When I read the short story, she described a New Orleans that I was not familiar with simply because she was talking about an 1800s New Orleans and I was sitting there 100 years later. And so that New Orleans sparked my interest when she described cobblestone streets, which I didn't even know what that was. And we actually drove down a cobblestone street to get to community bookstore. So she saw New Orleans for its richness and its layers. And she saw the people and she saw inside of people. And I think that this is why so many of us still teach her literature. So I do teach her, assign some of her short stories, her New Orleans-based short stories in my classes, but that wasn't enough for me. I had a question because I knew that the Dunbar came from the name Paul Laurence Dunbar. And I didn't know why she had married Paul Laurence Dunbar, who wasn't from New Orleans, but he was significantly darker than she was. And so why would she leave New Orleans to marry a man who was darker than she was if she was a Creole woman in the 1800s? And that was the book becomes the answer to that question because I had to do research. She marries Paul Laurence Dunbar. She's in a very abusive relationship, which I do discuss in the book. And he dies, she retains his name, which also means that doors are open to her because she's thought of as this respected woman who was married to this largely respected, talented man, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Paul Laurence Dunbar was also a complicated man. And so people were writing about Paul Laurence Dunbar, but writing about him to get to this woman was unacceptable to me. So when I found out that all of these archives, diaries, scrapbooks, work that she had written but hadn't published, she was a journalist, so she had a great deal of that work as well. When I found out that that material was available at the University of Delaware, then that's where I went to find the answer to the question. So I understood why she married Paul Laurence for complicated reasons. I understood why after his death, she engaged in other relationships with women, which she does. We know that through letters that were written to her from the woman who happened to be the principal at her school, so very complicated. And I was just given permission to take my mask off. So she married a second time. An alpha man just came in, an alpha man from Dillard University, to say that he calls her also by the last name of Callis because she was actually married to one of their, I think it's called Jules, who's a founding member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. She was married to him briefly, but she remained friends with him until her death, even though he remarried as well. And she married a third man who was more of her partner. So I think that she was also looking for someone that she could be married to, but also somebody who would respect her and really be in a partnership. There are scholars that have questioned whether or not she was actually in love with Robert Nelson, but if we read the diaries, we can see that she did love her husband and she enjoyed being with him. And it was complicated. I suppose marriages are. But during that period of time, starting with the time that she was in New Orleans, she became very active in the community after graduating from what is now Dillard University. Becoming a teacher in public schools. She also became involved with the Black Club Women's Movement. So locally, that was the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and the Phyllis Wheatley Club would start a school, would start a little hospital to provide services for Black people because segregation would not allow Black people to get equal services, not even at Charity Hospital, which had a separate wing for Black people. And locals, I see people here shaking their heads. Charity Hospital has been closed on Katrina, but that was the place where people who didn't have insurance would go. And so Flint Goodrich Hospital actually, for local folks, know that Flint Goodrich Hospital, which closed in 1983, what I was stunned to find out is that these Black women started that hospital, okay, with I think it was 2 beds and 7 doctors and nurses or something. So very little. They were able to get an appropriation from the city, but it wasn't enough, which tells us that the needs of Black people in the city were great because there was a large population of Black folks in New Orleans. And when I think about surrounding areas, I would imagine even still, because I know people from the West Bank where I live, where I'm from, where I grew up, still come over to what is now University Hospital to get services. So it just wasn't large enough. So she then also became the secretary of the National Association of Colored Women, and she would continue with the federated clubs throughout her life, and those organizations are still up and running. There are Black women's clubs, chapters of them, some of them that are independent from the federated clubs, but that are part of that as well. And then she was a suffragist. So we often hear about white women and maybe 1 or 2 Black women who were involved with the fight for women getting the right to vote. But Alice Dunbar used her name to get out there and to encourage people who had the right to vote, particularly in Pennsylvania, to vote for women to have the right to vote, because that was what they did to try to get states' rights. So you had the situation where directed someone to a chair. You had a situation with Alice Dunbar Nelson, who wore so many hats, who was a woman who was in service in the community through organizations that she was a member of. But there was one thing that haunted her throughout her life, which was the fact that whoever her father was, who was probably a white man, they would never talk about him in public. So her records show at least 3 different names of a man. The story that they told in public was that her father and her mother were married. Her mother was a formerly enslaved woman from Appaloosas, and I talk about the story of how she ended up in New Orleans. But they said that she was married to this man, but every time the census folks would knock on the door, the man was never there. And so eventually she goes from married to being widowed. There's no obituary or anything that mentions anything about this man's, when he died, anything about him. And so the story that her niece would tell, her niece was a librarian, was that her grandparents were Negroes of the middle class, which is again probably part of the story. So the mother probably has some sort of arrangement that would not have been so unknown or uncommon in New Orleans during a particular period, that provided her with an ability to give security for her 2 daughters. Because as much as that woman-centered family, they were all pretty much always together. They pretty much always lived together. The mother was never without her daughters, was never without living with her daughters. So when Alice leaves Paul Lawrence and goes to Wilmington, Delaware, the whole family goes with her. Okay. Even though the sister is married, the husband has left, so that family is always together. The mother dies, Alice moves to Philadelphia with her 3rd husband, the sister is there. Okay. So this was a woman-centered family from birth until death, which probably also influences why she was so interested in what was going on with women and their stability in local communities throughout the country also. So that's Alice Dunbar Nelson. I go into more details about certain relationships that she had. She had a very active social life. She was very well respected by W.E.B. Du Bois. Arturo Schomburg was somebody that she relied on for information. So some of the research that I did was actually at the Schomburg Center also. She knew Booker T. Washington. Margaret Murray Washington was a member of the Black Club Women's Movement as well. And so she was very well connected and very well known amongst the Black educated elite in the United States. And that is reflected in how they celebrated her in Black newspapers when she dies, how they talk about her. So that's Alice Dunbar Nelson. It took me 10 years to write that book. Okay. I thought it would take 2. It never took me 10 years to write any book. The only book that took me a little long, because I was thinking about it, was Reimagining the Middle Passage, which came out from Ohio State University a few years ago. And the reason why that took me a while to think about Black folks' connection to water is because Hurricane Katrina hit and I couldn't write. And so once it got to an anniversary of Katrina, I realized that I needed to actually sit down and write the book. So that's because I had an emotional connection to what I discussed in that book. Alice Dunbar Nelson, that book just took me a long time because of the research, because of the revision process, and so on. But then I began to wonder, how does this woman get to a point where she is given so much of herself and she dies really prematurely? She had a lot of health problems, even though she tried to think of ways to not be depressed or not to be overwhelmed. How can she escape? And so for her, going to the movies, going to plays, meditation, writing in her diary, going for walks, even when she traveled, those were ways in which she escaped. But then I began to think about, what if a Black woman just wants to live a life and not give so much of herself to the advancement of the race? And so that's where See Me Naked, Black Women Defining Pleasure during the interwar era comes from. Because the women that I talk about overlap with Alice Dunbar Nelson, even though she's older. Alice Dunbar Nelson was born in 1875, and she dies in 1935. The interwar era is the 1917 to about the early 1940s. So who would be the women that I would discuss? So I also wanted to have fun. I didn't want to read anything about Black women having these horrible experiences, even though that still comes into it. So I really wanted to give a different perspective on Black women in this country, and that's what a lot of Black women scholars are starting to do now anyway. So this pleasure book, as I call it, was me looking at certain women's lives and defining what I thought pleasure looked like. How did they express it? What was their pleasure practices? And so what were their pleasure practices? Because there are many. And so here are the women. Yolanda Du Bois, the only daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois. She was born in 1900. Lena Horne, whom everybody knows and loves, Lena Horne. She wrote an autobiography that was really telling about how she pursued what she wanted to pursue and how she wanted to define pleasure. Moms Mabley, everybody kept telling me, if you're going to write about pleasure, you need to look at Moms Mabley. You need to look at Moms Mabley. Well, I looked at Moms Mabley, first of all, because Moms Mabley, I would find out, was born in North Carolina. And, but she left when she was very young. She did have some tragedy and trauma in her younger life. But this woman made people laugh. And so I would listen to Moms Mabley and just laugh. And this was the first time I was able to write a book and have so much fun writing it, because I was laughing and I had to keep replaying her comedy, which we can find some of it on YouTube, and listen to her closely to understand her style and her technique. But she was also a storyteller. And so that's what I really love about her. And Memphis Minnie, because I always want, because I'm from the South, I always want to connect back to the South. And so first of all, her name is Memphis. You know she's a Southern woman. But then I would come to find out that she was born, and some people dispute this, whether she was born here or just raised here, but she was born probably in Algiers. And she made her way to Memphis. And the stories that I read about her, like her, that she would go into an alley and cut this man's arms off using a razor blade. So, okay, sure she did. yeah, sure. But people just had these stories about her because she was this blues woman. They would say for sure that she could outplay any man, but then they would also ascribe these masculine, rough characteristics to her. But when she's singing about the kind of pleasure that she wants, she's not singing about cutting off him by his arms or fighting or any of that kind of stuff. So I had a lot of fun with her. Sometimes I still drive around listening to Memphis Minnie, because all of these women are just incredibly talented. And so when I end the book with a chapter on Langston Hughes's Not Without Laughter. Not Without Laughter, which kind of got me thinking about this. Hughes is condemning Black club women and the politics of respectability and celebrating Black blues women. And he had to come to places like New Orleans, because if you don't talk about the blues, if you don't talk about jazz, then you got to come here. And so he writes about the influences of coming here and being on Rampart Street and all of this, these places in this area. So Langston Hughes just loved Black women. He really did. He had like a special, I call it a special kind of love for Black women, and so he celebrates them in his art, in the work that he does. So for me, in many ways, with what I do, all roads come back to the South. And there tends to be some sort of connection with the area that I'm from, to try to, which helps me to understand some of what I hear in the music, because my students will say, well, I don't understand what she's saying. I understand it. Right? Because there are people from generations back, even when I was a child, that sounded like these people. And I don't need a translator. I can hear them just fine. So those are the influences that brought me to the work of really wanting to write about Black women. So thank y'all for listening, and any questions y'all have.
You mentioned Lena Horne, but you didn't really say what she did for pleasure.
Yeah, because I discuss it in the book. But I'll give you an example. The film that she loved doing was Cabin in the Sky. Have you seen that? Oh, you've got to see Cabin in the Sky. She plays this character that's a temptress. So, you know, it's really the sort of Jezebel figure. She said, I had so much fun playing that role. And she looks like she had fun playing that role. And that role is in defiance of how her grandmother raised her to be and how her mother raised her to be. That you're not supposed to be sexy, that you're not supposed to be a temptress, that you're not supposed to be doing the things that she is trying to do in that film. And so every time I watch it, because I had to watch it multiple times to be able to write about it, she's just walking around smiling. And I just think that she was a really good actress who was underrated to some extent. When I see people writing about her, they don't see what I see in her, which was this woman who didn't have all of this. She didn't have a lot of resources in learning how to act or to sing or dance. She had a little bit of that, but she had to figure it out along the way. And so she figured out early what she wanted to do, and she stuck with it even when she wasn't comfortable doing some things, because she didn't always like an audience of white men looking at her. But she really does define pleasure also in her personal life also, while still being committed to the NAACP and trying to open up doors that had been closed to Black actresses. You know, reading about her, I also learned about Hollywood, which was really crazy during that time, the kinds of contracts that people would have you sign and everything, you know. So, yeah. Any other questions?
But the ladies that you wrote about, what did you get from it? Like, what can you like align with your life, or what really motivated you regarding?
So can I align with my life with Alice Dunbar Nelson to some degree? Yes, because She's from this area because she graduated from now with Stiller University, because she wrote the lyrics to the Delta hymn, the hymn for Delta Sigma Theta. So that drew me to her. I didn't know the Delta part until later. And the fact that she was also somebody that kept going back to school, and I don't keep going back to school, but she was what we call a lifelong learner. And so there's an adinkra symbol for that. But she was always reading. She was always trying to be better and smarter, and she would bring that into the classroom for her students. So that I get. Because whatever I knew when I graduated in 2000 with a PhD is just not enough. You have to keep reading. You have to keep going and getting an education and so on. So that I got. The fact that she's married 3 times, that she's in relationships with women, I mean, that sort of sticky, dramatic, personal life, I could not handle that. I could not. I was barely holding on, going through the research to figure out who are these people. So, but I learned a lot of lessons in writing about her and these women, the 4 women from See Me Naked, because they insisted on defining who they were. And so I was writing that book. I finished that book during the first year of the pandemic. So what can I learn from them and how they are understanding pleasure and defining it and practicing it? So I became more thoughtful about my surroundings in nature. I became more thoughtful about writing and meditation. So I think that people can learn quite a bit because I was deliberate and really trying to show what these women did separate from the work that they were doing, which was a lot. They were always like working, but also how sometimes that work brought them pleasure. And I think that is important to really think about what a privilege that could be to get pleasure out of the work. And I think that was an inspiration and motivation for a lot of what they did.
I didn't really speak at all about their religious connection or how that tradition among us influenced them.
Yeah.
Did you see anything there?
No, because that wasn't primary for them. So Alice Dunbar Nelson was religious, but she was also spiritual. So I do talk about, when I say meditation, that came from something that she was doing connected to something that was organized. But I think that she struggled with that as she got older. Something happened at a church that she makes a reference to with a pastor or something. So these are not, I'm trying to think of any of these women. These were not, now Moms Mabley actually was an active member of Obsidian Baptist Church in Harlem. So even though she was a lesbian, she would go dressed in, not in a dress or anything like that, but she would go dressed as how she normally dressed when she wasn't on the stage. So, her most well-known jokes are about, I can't stand no old men. And then she'll start telling us why. And she really could not stand any old men. Because she would go, to her dressing room at the Apollo Theater, and there would be a woman for her. And everybody knew that about her. But her there were people, actors and people in the business who knew that, but people, I think her large base didn't know that. And I don't know how much they would have cared, because it's not like the jokes that she was telling would be jokes that you would tell at a church anyway. So, and it's funny because they get even more wilder the older she gets. Because there were a couple that I didn't even catch the punchline. I'm like, wait a minute. So, but for the most part, what you may be looking for, of women that come from the Bible Belt that are religious and you just not with these women. Yeah.
So there is a question. How did Lawrence Dunbar's suicide affect Alice?
There's no suicide. So I'm not sure unless somebody has heard somebody knows something that I don't know.
Okay.
But I'm not aware of any suicide. He had been sick for a really long time.
So this was from Randall Morris Jelks. Should we bring him up to ask him a
Yeah,
question?
hey Randall.
So Mr. Jelks, we're going to ask you to come on and share with us. He should know the drill because we had him as a speaker recently. So let's wait until he comes on. And he's accepting the invitation.
Okay.
There he is.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. No,
You
what I
just
meant by suicide, Paul was notorious as an alcoholic, and that's what I think is one of the underlying conditions. And I discovered in a volume some interesting love letters between he and Alice.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I asked that question. And the other question I had is this real that I wrote a book called Faith and Struggle in the Lives of Four African Americans. And I begin with Ethel Waters. And of course, Ethel Waters also were in intimate love relationships with women. So it doesn't seem that improbable in that age. We always think of that age as being more conservative. People were just private as opposed to being more conservative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, there could be legal ramifications for being known for being in relationships with someone of the same gender. But certainly, Ethel Waters, that also speaks to the connection of why so many Black artists spent time in France, because there was more openness there than there was in the United States. And you mentioned Ethel Waters. Of course, she's a contemporary of Lena Horne, and there was a kind of rivalry, and as such, that I just briefly mentioned.
Very, very. It was over stormy weather because Ethel Waters that was her hit, and then they brought in this young thing, as she says in letters, to try to displace it, and she was highly competitive. It's her song, and so even in the film Stormy Weather, she's still pissed that Lena Horne is singing her song, as she says.
Yeah, I mean, these women were
highly competitive.
They were highly competitive, but you get it because there were so few roles for Black women during that time. But Ethel Waters, of course, is the star of Cabin in the Sky. So, but going back to the Paul Laurence Dunbar, the question that I will answer is, how did she respond to his death? So she doesn't know that Paul Laurence has died until she reads about it. And so, because they're not together anymore, she's left him. And so he's with his mama in Ohio, and she's in Wilmington taking care of her business with her family and teaching. I do discuss it because she writes back and forth with an older gentleman about how that made her feel. Yeah. But I dedicate the book to domestic violence survivors.
Yeah. He was abusive. Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care. Any other questions? So y'all love Lena Horne?
Mom Mosby. I didn't really know anything about her until the movie came out,
Yeah.
and she was a rough character.
Oh, yeah.
But I related to her in that era.
Mm-hmm.
All the power that she had and the tenacity, and she didn't worry about what people say. She stood ground.
She did. She did. And you know, she had to be tough because there weren't black women. She was the top billed black woman, and so her brother wrote some of her jokes, but she just gets better and better over time, and she starts to command those spaces. But you know, people are showing up for pig meat and all these other black people. But she learned on the Chitlin circuit where black women were doing extremely well in comedy, where black women were doing extremely well in their communities. What Zora Neale Hurston talks about, and I make that connection as well. So, and to some extent, when she actually gets on the stage, it's the business that she might be pushing against, but the fact that she is speaking and making people laugh, that's not that big of a deal in terms of where she comes from and where she's gotten her training. Yeah. Yeah, Mom's Mabley is just so funny.
But if I'm not mistaken, I think Whoopi was thinking about going or what, like comedy or a show or movie or something.
Well, she did do a documentary, yeah, which I found very helpful in my research. Wanda Sykes on another show, The Marvelous Mrs. Mabel, does a nod to her at the Apollo, and I kept wondering, where's Mom's Mabley? I mean, because the focus of that show is on a white woman, but then there's this black woman who's commanding space, and are people just gonna pretend like she didn't exist? Mm-hmm. So Wanda Sykes does a cameo. Yeah. But I don't think that I knew how much people love Lena Horne until I was reading, and because by the time I came along, you know, she was pretty old, and so I didn't have any sense of how much Black people really enjoyed seeing Lena Horne. What did y'all like about Lena Horne? Just sort of let me know what was your.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We had the opportunity to see her when she came to the Blue Room.
Okay, when was that? Because somebody told me about that. Was that the 80s or something?
What I can't remember the year.
Okay.
But it was also there was an epic thing that was going on in the city at the time.
Okay.
So it may have been around the time with, I'd say, the changing of the guard, where we were going from the all white to integrating, yes, you know, integrating. But what was so strange to us, because it was 4 of us that had gone, my husband, Lloyd and Claudia, the 4 of us, and we were like trying to find a seat in the area. And so they said, oh no, we have seats up here. You can come and sit up here. So there was like a table for 4, and we went to the front area, and the stage may have been right there. And so she did an outstanding performance. And they said they made an announcement after my husband decided that he was going to take a picture.
With a camera, not a phone, a camera.
Listen, with a real live camera, that he was going to take a picture, not to take, cameras weren't allowed, and they were going to take the camera. And she said, "Oh no," she said. But the crazy thing about it, the film, we had no film in the camera.
Oh my God.
He did, she posed and everything. And so that was the joke all the way home. I cannot believe you had Lena Horne in front of your face and you didn't realize that there was no film. And that was something in the I don't know if you remember the Blue Room at the Roosevelt Hotel, but it was basically predominantly white.
Okay.
And so you could count us on, it was the four of us, and we looked around and there may have been maybe scattered two or maybe one over there, that kind of thing. And so wasn't many of us at all, but it was packed with everybody else.
Okay.
So that to us was strange.
Yeah.
We kind of like made note of that mentally. The quality that was there in us. We thought there would have been more Black folk, but there wasn't.
Yeah.
And back then, the cost of a ticket was like $35. Now, and at that time, $35 was a big thing.
Yeah, that's a great memory. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So I just she was just an eloquent person. Black people were just really proud of her.
Did an album. Her whole album, movie, from all of her the movies that she had done, she sang all of those songs, and it was just phenomenal.
Okay, and that's the sense that I get watching her, is that she really took pride in being a performer. That she always wanted to be better. And that's the same with the women that are performers that I discuss in the book. Now with Yolanda Du Bois, she wanted to be a really good teacher. And so whatever their vocation was that they felt called to do, that they really wanted to be just good at it. And they got immense pleasure in that pride that made them feel good. Yeah. Good to hear. Did anybody hear Mom's Mabley Live? Anybody go to those concerts? Did y'all have the albums?
Well, I was younger, so I wasn't allowed to.
You wasn't. Nobody's
we did have the album.
Okay.
Like my mom and her friends, when they would have their club meeting, that would be their thing. But we were never allowed to sit in the presence of them listening at, because she was Mom's neighbor. And she was Mom's neighbor.
Yeah.
It was like, you were like, did she say that for real?
And it's tamed by, what we hear and see now. That's the funny part.
Yeah.
it's like a female version of Richard Pryor and Red Fox.
Yeah, Red Fox,
Red Fox,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah,
Put it out there.
yeah, she
Yeah.
could definitely hang with Red Fox.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, hilarious when she talks about those old men. And it's just the way that she sounds so disgusted when she says, I don't like no old men. It's like, it just sounds so sincere that she really means that there's a particular old man that she was thinking about. And she'll tell the whole story, and this happened and that happened, and when you know you're leaning in, waiting for it to get to the end, and you just fall out. It's just her ability to be able to do that, and people are waiting to laugh. You know, it's just that's talent. I'd say. Yeah. So I don't know if anybody else has any questions or comments about any of the women I've discussed.
I'd just like to say it was a very good presentation.
Thank you.
And it really make you inclined to buy books, to learn more.
Mhm.
And during that era, it was so good to have them.
Yeah.
It was so good to have some blacks on TV
Mhm.
saying something, regardless. She was funny. Miles Mabel was very funny. Neil Horn was a good singer, plus actress, and we enjoyed them. But they paved the way for so many. That's what they're doing, and we're so grateful for them because they did pave the way for so many blacks that's coming behind them. And to hear that Alice Dunbar did so much too as a teacher and helping, and then wrote the song for Delta. They're very good and just very good presentation. So to make me want to buy both books.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing because I remember Charity Hospital when we would have to go and sit in a certain area to be waited on. And I was an asthmatic child. And so my dad, this particular day, brought me to the hospital because I was having a bad asthma attack. We must have gone about 7 o'clock that night, and at 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning, we were still waiting.
And you were having an asthma attack?
I was having an asthma.
Wow.
Well, they brought oxygen out, you know, and put the oxygen on me.
Okay.
But still, I had not been seen or anything, and I was still wheezing and sitting in my daddy's arms, waiting to be waited on. And he was so aggravated until he took the oxygen off me, gave it back to him, and we left and went to Flint, Goodrich.
Oh.
That's how I got to go to Flint, Goodrich.
Okay.
And we started going there. So that was amazing.
Yeah. But that is amazing because that's exactly what she was talking about in the late 1800s.
Yes.
That we have to start this because of what's going on at Charity, and then it becomes the Flint Goodrich.
Right. Right.
Wow. And this is in the 1900s. Like, wow. That's yeah. I just learned something. Thank you for sharing that. It's
And he
amazing.
swore and he would never go back to Charity.
Yeah.
And we never did.
Uh-huh.
I mean, absolutely never did.
As a parent, though, to think, I mean, like, you could have died. I mean, people are going for help and with their little children. So how helpless he must have felt, and just in the anger and just, that's sad.
I did a one-woman show and I have six historical characters that I put some focus on. And during my study, I act to teach, actually drama, was church-based, but I go to community centers, and that's why I'm here today. I'm so glad to hear you and to hear that there have been other books have been published, and there are others, great Black women. There's so many great Black women. I can't do them all, but I definitely would like, I would like to read your book. But when I did the study of Sojourner, Harriet, Mrs. King, and Rosa Parks, and finally Michelle Obama, I want to just capture the essence of the Blackness, the strength, and all of that in those women, because we all are so unique and different.
Right.
And when I look at the younger generation, my daughter, Mama, why are we supposed to be so strong? Why not? And I don't want them to lose that. And I'm so, kind of scared that they might and act like something else that they're not. And so I'm really glad that you're writing, written that and continue to write about us, because there's something there that has to be captured and shown and appreciated.
Thank you, and I hope you'll add Alice Dunbar Nelson to the ad. But I think that part of what happens with strength is that you have to go through so much to be strong. And so, for so long, Black women have celebrated that, and at the funeral, I had this conversation with my students that the best thing that people could hear is that she was a strong Black woman. But really, sometimes women, what does that do to us mentally? And what does that do to us physically? And so this woman is just one example. This woman is a survivor of domestic abuse. So she's born in 1875. She dies in 1935. That's young. She had physical problems most of her life that probably stemmed from the relationship that she had with her first husband. Her body is in such disrepair. Washington, D.C. requires women to go through all of this physical, these checks by doctors and taking blood and all this, that, and the other. And she can't pass the test. And it's amazing. Now I'm looking at this, some people with teaching backgrounds in this room. I know that. Imagine people all up in your body so you can get a job to teach, right? I teach. And I can't imagine having to submit because you don't know where those records are going and all of this stuff. So she says at one point, I've never had so many men look at my patty waddy in all of my life. Because she feels violated by this, right?
Yeah.
But it's not her fault that she can't pass the test. She has both of her stepchildren and two of her nieces die at an early age because of health problems. So yeah, she probably would get the mark of being strong, but she had to go through so much as a Black woman. So
she was broken down.
She was because she was a Black woman. So she's suffering in her home and dealing with all that stuff outside of her home, right? So that's why I do want to complicate, because your daughter might be asking that question. It is a complicated question. On one hand, we can see it as a compliment, but what do you have to go through to get the compliment?
But because you went through that, you passed that generational blessing that's instinctive. It's resilience. It's so many other things as well. And it's a gift. It's a power that we only possess. I tell her, I say, you don't have to try to be anything. That's the way you are. You've never been a white woman, right? So you don't know how it is to be anything other than Black.
Yeah.
So to add to that, when we talk about the strength that we must possess in being a Black woman, when we look at the younger generations, they possess the same strength, but it's shown differently. They have different characteristics of their strength.
Yeah.
No longer are they accepting of what people are doing to them.
Right.
They're taking more ownership
Yeah,
and empowering themselves
Mhm.
so they can impact their community in a different manner. So the strength is seen different.
Mhm.
A lot of times we don't believe people are strong unless they deal with hardship.
Yeah.
What if I remove the hardship from my life, make better choices, and put myself in different arenas so I can become a better help to my community.
Mhm.
And now I'm not suffering in society as much. Still going to experience, those controversies, but I'm not accepting of the issues as willingly as people have in the past.
That had to, yeah.
Yeah, they kind of had to. And so those women have paved the way for us to be able to not experience those things. But I think the younger generation, they sometimes want to disconnect from experiencing the hardship, but still impacting the community in a powerful way. It just looks different.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're still strong, they're still resilient, but it looks different.
Yeah.
They don't want to suffer in silence.
Mhm.
Domestic abuse, they no longer are suffering in silence. They're speaking up, and there are people who are willing to help them. And so thank you to the ladies who have paved the way. And many of the ladies who have paved my way are sitting right here around me. But in saying that, just understanding that even your daughter, it looks different. She still embodies the same thing. She has your DNA. But she won't address things the same way you see it. But in the long run, you'll see her strength. Because it took all of her life before we acknowledged it.
And that's really what they did. Yeah, that was what they did. That's what Alice Dunbar Nelson did. She left Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And that's why he dies by himself with his mother in Ohio. He was a troubled man. And that's why she gets married 3 times. She settles finally on a man that sees her as a partner, that respects her, that they can walk together. Right? So whatever he suffers, she suffers, she suffers, he suffers. So this, I really see that as a partnership. And she was married to him the longest out of the 3 husbands. So yeah, people don't get married 3 times unless they're looking for something in particular, because that's a lot of work. And so, and she had choices. This was apparently a woman that was very socially engaged, and that was a desirable woman. So when she chose him, he was chosen.
Do you see either of your books being turned into plays?
I hadn't even thought about that, and it's interesting because Alice Dunbar Nelson was a playwright. Starting here in New Orleans, she was a part. This woman loved drama, like in her life and and writing about it. But she wrote plays for children. She wrote a play that was published in The Crisis, and she was part of a drama group here in New Orleans when she's much younger. She leaves here when she's 20 years old. Yeah. But I invite anybody to take the book, just give me credit when you do your whatever you want to do with it, and take her work and do more with it. But really my hope is that to introduce people to Alice Dunbar Nelson, and because some of us may know her here, people know her in literature, but she's in so many different areas. So I just hope that people will read the book, learn more about her, write other books about her, write whatever. As long as just give me the
I
credit.
like to take a synopsis of a play or a book and present it to church. Because people don't read anymore.
Yeah. Well, people read.
People read, really?
Yeah, this book is.
Cicely Tyson. I mean, what I'm saying,
Yeah, people read.
But let me say, the younger people prefer not to read. They do the computer. My daughter got a graduate degree.
It depends on what it is.
Have many books. She had the computer. Anyway, I'm just saying, we miss out on not reading thoroughly, because the last book I bought was Cicely Tyson's book, and it's very thick, and my 2 friends have not completed it yet, but I gave it to. But anyway, I would like to summarize these characters and just throw them out there so people can at least know about them. And visually, we're so visual these days.
Yeah.
So it's so funny to be seen that way.
Yeah, I mean, any interpretation, I think that she would really enjoy that. Now, she would criticize you to the ends of the earth, but because you know that's like part of her era. So I could just see her having all sorts of comments for you on the performances, because she wrote about that was what part of what she did in her editorial. She wrote about Black people, performers in these plays and their poetry readings. She always said positive things, but then she makes some snide comments in her diary, for example. Like, this person's getting too fat to be out there doing all that acting on the screen, and Michelle needs to get someone else. So, you know, some of it is just funny, but it's real. I mean, she was a real person. So thank y'all so much. I don't know if there are any other questions on there.
Don't see any, or on Facebook. Make the last call.
Well, there's a link for both books, so please purchase from Community. I call it Community Bookstore, but it's Book Center, right?
Yes.
Community Book Center. Support Black independent bookstore owners and a Black woman. These are about Black women, so support them.
Going on 40 years.
Going on 40 years. Yeah, I always say they survived Katrina, but
Amen.
that's wow. That's an accomplishment.
Yeah.
Yeah, here. Yeah.
Yeah, good job. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I did. I can see without my glasses.
Confusing me today. She came up in here, I didn't know who she was.
Oh, yeah.
And she said, I said, spell your last name. She said, O-S-B-E-Y. I said, and then I punched it up and pushed her name down and said, I said, Brenda? Hey!
Was that still on?
Yes.
Oh.
Let me go ahead and